On the night of August 14, 1986, 8 men entered the Louisiana Bayou and never returned. They were not strangers to the swamp. They knew the water, the heat, the insects, and the risks. Yet by morning, both pickup trucks were found abandoned, doors open, engines cold. No signs of panic, no bodies. Only silence where 8 voices should have been. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. The Louisiana Bayou is not empty land. It is a shifting maze of water, mud, and vegetation that swallows sound and direction. At night, visibility collapses, paths disappear. Even experienced locals lose their sense of distance. In 1986, law enforcement understood one thing clearly. Once something vanished into the bayou, recovery depended on luck more than skill. The men had entered the area for overnight work near an abandoned logging canal, a place rarely used since the early 1970s. They expected to finish before dawn and drive home. Families waited through the night. By sunrise, concern turned into alarm when no one answered the radio. By noon, deputies were searching roads that ended abruptly in water. The first truck was found tilted into mud along a service road, keys still in the ignition. The second sat deeper in the swamp, its bed empty except for rope and tools. There were no skid marks, no footprints leading away, no evidence of struggle. It looked less like an accident and more like something that had been interrupted mid-movement. What unsettled investigators most was the scale of the disappearance. 8 adult men do not vanish simultaneously without noise or resistance. The bayou had claimed lives before, but never all at once, and never this cleanly. Whatever happened that night unfolded fast, controlled, and without witnesses, leaving behind questions the swamp refused to answer. Search operations began within hours, but the bayou resisted every effort. Boats moved slowly through narrow channels where water hid fallen trees and sudden drop-offs. Airboats stirred thick mud, destroying whatever fragile traces might have existed. Dogs lost scent almost immediately. Heat, insects, and rising water worked together, erasing evidence as quickly as investigators tried to find it. Within the first day, officials realized this was not a standard disappearance. No bodies surfaced. No personal items floated free. Not even a boot or a hat appeared in the water. For 8 men to vanish without leaving a single physical trace suggested something deliberate, something planned, or something locals were not talking about. By the second night, rumors began spreading through nearby communities. Some claimed gunshots had been heard deep in the swamp. Others spoke of arguments over timber rights and unpaid work. A few mentioned names quietly, only when they were sure no outsiders were listening. The bayou had rules, and one of them was silence. Investigators noticed inconsistencies almost immediately. The route the men took made little sense for the job they were supposed to do. Equipment left behind suggested they never began working at all. It appeared they were intercepted shortly after arrival, before tools were used, before engines cooled, before anyone realized danger had entered the swamp with them. As days passed, pressure mounted. Families demanded answers. Media arrived only to leave frustrated. Without bodies, without witnesses, without cooperation, the case stalled. And as the bayou returned to its normal rhythms, it became clear that whatever truth existed beneath the water was being actively buried by nature, by people, or by both. By the third day, investigators began to understand the limits of the search. The bayou was not just terrain, it was a boundary. Certain areas were avoided, not because they were inaccessible, but because locals quietly warned against entering them. Deputies received vague advice to leave that water alone and to stop asking questions that didn't need answers. Attention turned to recent disputes in the area. Timber contracts had changed hands. Informal work crews competed for access to the same stretches of land. Money was owed. Promises had been broken. None of it appeared in official records, but everyone nearby seemed to know the same fragmented story, told differently depending on who was listening. What stood out most was how quickly conversations ended. Witnesses remembered seeing the trucks earlier that evening, but not later. Some heard voices, but not words. Others recalled lights moving through the trees, then stopping. No one saw faces. No one identified suspects. Each statement offered just enough to suggest awareness, and just enough to deny responsibility. Law enforcement faced a familiar problem in isolated communities: cooperation without commitment. People spoke in implications, not facts. The bayou, they implied, handled its own problems. Outsiders were expected to accept that explanation and move on. And slowly, officially, that is exactly what happened. Without evidence, without remains, and without testimony strong enough to stand in court, the case stalled. Files were marked inactive. Patrols ended. Search boats were pulled from the water. But the disappearance of 8 men remained an open wound, one that never healed, only learned how to stay hidden. In the months that followed, the bayou returned to normal. Water levels shifted, vegetation closed in, and paths that once existed vanished completely. No remains surfaced. No weapons were recovered. The trucks were eventually impounded, then released, carrying nothing that could explain where 8 men had gone. Officially, the case remained unsolved. Unofficially, everyone seemed to know it would stay that way. Families waited for calls that never came. Some kept lights on at night, convinced their sons or husbands might still find a way out of the swamp. Others accepted the silence, not as closure, but as survival. In communities near the bayou, asking too many questions had consequences. Remembering too loudly did as well. Years later, former deputies admitted the truth in fragments. Certain areas were never searched. Certain names were never written down. Not because evidence was lacking, but because evidence pointed to an outcome no one wanted to confront. In places like the bayou, justice did not always arrive wearing a badge. By the early 1990s, the file was quietly archived. The disappearance of 8 men became a local warning rather than a case study. Don't work where you're not invited. Don't ask who controls the water, and never assume the swamp kills by accident. The Louisiana Bayou Massacre of 1986 left no graves, no trials, and no answers, only absence. 8 men entered the water that night. What happened next was swallowed by mud, silence, and fear. And sometimes that is all a place allows the world to know. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. These are the stories the bayou never gave back, and the ones that still demand to be remembered.